In towns like Dry Hollow, the festival was sacred. It happened once a year, when the wind softened and lanterns danced in the windows. Folks would wear their best boots, polish their belt buckles, and hang strings of golden wheat from porch posts. There was music, laughter, and pies that tasted like someone's memory of home. But not everyone was welcome. Some men were shadows, kept outside the glow, spoken of in low voices, never invited inside the circle. He was one of them. They called him Caleb, when they bothered to speak of him at all. A drifter, some said. A hired gun who traded bullets for fence mending and hard whiskey. He lived near the edge of the valley in a half-built cabin with more splinters than walls. No family, no friends. The kind of man who looked like the land had carved him instead of the other way around. When the festival was planned, no one knocked on his door. No one left an invitation at the general store in his name. And that, everyone seemed to think, was just the way it should be. But on the night of the first frost, when the stars burned low and the earth cracked beneath your step, a scream tore through the quiet. Faint, desperate, swallowed by the cold, but loud enough for him to hear. Caleb didn't think. He grabbed his coat, his lantern, and followed the sound through the trees. What he found was a girl, no more than 13, collapsed in the snow, her lips blue, her dress torn, and her breath barely there. She had tried to reach the town. She hadn't made it. He didn't ask her name. She couldn't speak. He just picked her up in his arms and started walking, through snowbanks, through wind that could cut through bone, through a night that didn't want to give her back. Every step was heavier than the last. Every breath she took was a battle. And every time he thought he might fall, he looked at her face and kept moving. Because sometimes the cold doesn't just try to kill you. It tries to see if you'll give up. By the time Caleb reached the edge of Dry Hollow, the lanterns were glowing, the music was playing, and not a single person had noticed the life fading in the snow just beyond their fields. But they noticed when he appeared, soaked, frozen, cradling the girl like she was made of porcelain and prayer. The music stopped, the laughter faded, and for the first time, every eye in town turned toward the man they had never invited. What they saw that night would rewrite everything they thought they knew about silence, strength, and salvation. The moment Caleb stepped into the lantern light with the girl in his arms, a ripple of silence cut through the celebration like a blade. The fiddle strings went still mid-note. People froze with pies in hand and boots halfway through a dance. They stared, not just at the girl clutched against his chest, but the man they had spent years pretending didn't exist. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The snow clinging to his coat and the way the girl's hand dangled limply at his side said more than any words could have managed. Miss Lorna, the town's midwife, was the first to move. She pushed through the crowd, her apron still dusted with flour, and reached for the girl. Caleb didn't release her immediately. He looked into Lorna's eyes, not with defiance, but with a strange, almost childlike uncertainty, like he was asking permission to let go of something sacred. She nodded softly. "I've got her now," she whispered, and only then did he surrender the girl into her arms, his own shaking from cold and weight. Sheriff Briggs stepped forward next, hand resting on the grip of his revolver out of habit, not threat. He looked at Caleb the way a man looks at a ghost, half awe, half guilt. "Where'd you find her?" he asked. Caleb's voice was raw. "East Ridge, near the ravine. She was trying to get back here." A few townsfolk gasped. That trail was steep, brutal, no place for a child. Especially not in the dark. Especially not alone. Someone whispered the girl's name. Maggie. Maggie Turner. That name changed everything. Maggie was the blacksmith's niece. She'd gone missing the day before, last seen picking wild berries near the river bend. They'd assumed she got turned around, maybe wandered off. But no one had formed a search party. It was festival week. People were busy. Everyone had trusted that someone else would look. But it wasn't someone else who found her. It was the man no one ever asked anything of. Caleb didn't stay long. Once Lorna and a few women rushed the girl inside the church for warmth and care, he turned and began to walk back into the dark. No applause. No thanks. Just silence. The kind that follows a truth too heavy to name. But as he crossed the edge of the square, a small voice called out behind him. "Wait." He turned. It was the mayor's wife. Her eyes were wet. "Please stay." Caleb paused, nodded once, and stepped back into the light. They gave him a blanket, not out of charity, but necessity. The man was shaking. His coat was stiff with frost, his boots soaked through. He sat by the fire pit at the edge of the festival, away from the music, where the light flickered soft and uncertain. People didn't swarm him. They hovered, unsure how to bridge the space between exclusion and gratitude. It was easier to pretend he didn't exist than to confront the way they'd let him fade. But now, sitting there with frostbitten fingers and a faraway stare, he was undeniable. Eli Turner, Maggie's uncle, was the next to approach. A hard man, built like an anvil, with smoke in his beard and fire in his eyes. He once told folks Caleb wasn't worth the dust on his boots. But now, his niece was alive because of that same dust-covered man. He sat beside Caleb without saying a word. Just sat, letting the fire crackle between them like a confession neither one could speak. After a long while, Eli said, "I didn't look for her." Caleb didn't turn his head. "But you would have, if you knew where she was." That single sentence hit like a stone in still water. Because Caleb hadn't said it with blame, he said it with understanding. Maybe even forgiveness. And in a place like Dry Hollow, forgiveness was rarer than gold. The fire burned warmer after that. The silence eased a little. A few children crept closer, their small eyes curious. One handed Caleb a cup of cider with both hands. "You're the one who saved Maggie," the boy whispered. Caleb took the cup carefully, nodded once. "She saved herself. I just helped her finish the walk." Inside the church, Maggie had begun to stir. Lorna said she'd be weak for days, but she'd live. Word spread fast. Not like gossip, but like gospel. The town hadn't just been spared a tragedy. They'd been handed a lesson. One they hadn't asked for. One that came wrapped in snow, silence, and a man they had once called nobody. But now that same man sat in the heart of their celebration, and they didn't quite know what to do with that. So they did what the West teaches best. They listened. To the fire. To the stillness. To the way the wind softened around a man who had carried a child through it. And, slowly, something unspoken began to shift. Not because Caleb demanded it, but because he had earned it. Not with words. Not with power. But with the kind of strength the West respects most. Quiet, unwavering, and carved into the bone. The next morning, Dry Hollow didn't wake with fanfare or music. It woke with hush, the kind of quiet that settles over a place when something sacred has taken root. The festival lanterns still swung in the breeze, but the laughter was gone, replaced by something deeper. Reverence. Caleb was still at the church steps when the sun broke over the mountains, sitting on the edge of the frostbit porch, watching the light stretch across the dirt. He hadn't asked for shelter. He hadn't slept, just stayed nearby, as if the girl's breath had become tethered to his own. Inside, Maggie slept peacefully. Her hand never let go of the shawl they'd wrapped her in, the one Lorna said Caleb had draped around her halfway through the walk. He wrapped her tighter than himself, she told the mayor later. He nearly froze, but she never did. The mayor rubbed his chin, heavy with guilt, and we never noticed she was gone until he brought her back. It wasn't just shame they carried now. It was awakening, the kind that changes how a town breathes. When Caleb finally stood, he stretched like a man made of rust. His body was stiff, but his eyes were clear. Lorna offered him a place to stay. The general storekeeper offered supplies. Eli Turner even said he'd pay for a new coat. Caleb didn't answer any of them. He just walked toward the edge of town again, where the trees began and the dirt road faded into silence. The people didn't want him to leave, but no one knew how to ask him to stay. Until Maggie's voice broke through the morning chill. "You didn't let go." She stood weakly at the door of the church, holding the frame for support. Her voice was soft but certain. "Even when it hurt, you didn't let go." Caleb turned slowly, his face unreadable. And then, for the first time anyone could remember, he smiled. Not wide, not long, but enough to prove he'd hurt her. Enough to show that something inside him had changed, too. And that's when the mayor stepped forward, clearing his throat, hat in hand. "Caleb," he said, "we can't change how we treated you before, but we like to make something right. There's a barn on the east side of the field. Needs fixing. Could use a hand like yours." It wasn't a gift. It wasn't pity. It was something better, a bridge. The kind of offer the West rarely gives twice. Caleb looked at the mayor, then at Maggie, then at the town behind them, and for the first time in years, he nodded without hesitation. Word traveled fast across neighboring towns. Dry Hollow's drifter saved a girl, they said. The man with no name. He walked her through the ice like he was carrying the weight of the world. Some twisted the tale, made him out to be a legend, a ghost, a long-lost outlaw, seeking redemption. But those who saw it, those who stood there that night, they knew better. Caleb wasn't a ghost. He was a man, flesh and blood. And the only thing he carried more fiercely than the girl was the silence of a life lived without belonging. Over the next few days, Caleb began working on the barn. The structure was older than most folks in town, sagging with memories and missing more nails than it held. But Caleb knew how to work with broken things. He didn't talk much, just hammered, sawed, and nodded when someone brought coffee or tools. But every swing of his hammer echoed something new in Dry Hollow, a reminder that rebuilding starts quietly, one beam at a time, one choice at a time. Children came by after school, peeking over the rails to watch him work. He didn't mind. One girl asked if she could help. Caleb handed her a nail and a smile. You hold it steady. That's the most important part. They never forgot that, and neither did the town. Folks started stopping by, offering lumber, paint, even old horseshoes for good luck. It wasn't about the barn anymore. It was about what the barn represented. A second chance nailed into the wood grain, a memory etched into the beams. Maggie visited every afternoon. She'd bring a small jar of honey or a book or just sit and listen to the breeze. She never asked questions about where he came from. She just said thank you. And one day, she brought him a hand-drawn invitation. For next year's festival, it read. To the man who never asked to be invited, but came anyway. Caleb took the paper, folded it slowly, and tucked it into his coat pocket like it was made of gold. And so, the town that once pretended he didn't exist began to shift. Not with noise, but with presence. Not out of guilt, but out of growth. Because they had witnessed something rare. A man who walked through cold not for glory, but for grace. And now that grace had begun to take root. In nails and wood, in warm cider shared on cold porches, and in the slow, steady beating of a heart that once lived on the outside, now finally finding its place within. By the time autumn gave way to the first flurries of winter, the barn stood tall again. Clean lines, strong beams, and a new coat of red paint that gleamed against the pale sky. But what stood out most wasn't the structure, it was the gathering. Folks from Dry Hollow had started visiting the barn not for work, but for company. Someone brought a rocking chair. Someone else added a porch lamp. Soon, it became a kind of meeting place, a quiet refuge where words came slower and hearts opened more easily. Caleb, without planning it, had built more than a barn. He'd built trust. One evening, as snow began to fall gently, Maggie brought a small basket wrapped in cloth. Inside were ginger cookies, still warm. "My ma helped," she said with a smile. Caleb sat on the stoop of the barn and took one, nodding in thanks. She sat beside him in silence, the way she always did, not to fill space, but to share it. "I remember the cold," she whispered after a while. "But I remember your hands more." Caleb looked at her then, eyes soft. "The cold wasn't what scared me," she added. "It was being alone, until you came." That night, the mayor announced at a town gathering that the barn would be used as a new community hall. Not because the town needed a hall, but because it needed a place built on something real. "We owe that to Caleb," he said aloud, tipping his hat in the direction of the man who once ate in silence at the back of the saloon. The townspeople murmured their agreement. For the first time in years, they saw each other differently. It wasn't just Caleb who had changed, they all had. Still, Caleb remained the same in the ways that mattered. He didn't ask for attention. He didn't speak long, but he smiled more. He waved at children. He took his coffee beside the fire in the general store. And slowly, people stopped calling him that drifter. They called him by name. And for a man who had once been invisible, that was the loudest welcome he'd ever known. As the snow thickened and the festival lanterns were packed away for another year, something remained. Not a decoration, not a celebration, but a presence, a memory that would not fade. It lived in the boards of the barn, in the steps along the ridge, and in the heart of a girl who remembered what it felt like to be carried. Not because she was helpless, but because someone believed she was worth saving. In the Old West, where legends are often carved by gunfire, Caleb's legacy was built in footsteps, slow, deliberate, and forever unforgettable. The following spring brought with it a softness that Dry Hollow hadn't felt in years. Wildflowers sprouted along the edge of the church steps, and the fields buzzed with new life. But what returned most was something you couldn't see, a quiet kind of dignity. Caleb had started tending to the land near the old riverbank. What was once a dry patch of brush became rows of herbs, potatoes, beans. Maggie called it Caleb's garden and helped him plant every seed. People began stopping by not just to admire the crops, but to speak with him. They came with quiet questions, small confessions, cups of coffee in exchange for silence and listening. Somehow, the man who had been left out of every invitation had become the one people turned to when their hearts felt heavy. He didn't offer answers. He didn't give advice. But in the West, sometimes being present was more healing than any sermon. One late afternoon, Eli Turner arrived at the edge of the garden, a folded letter in his hand. "It's from her parents," he said, referring to Maggie's kin out east. "They want her to visit, maybe stay." Caleb didn't flinch, but his breath caught. "What did she say?" Eli scratched his beard. "She said she'd only go if you went with her. Said she wants to show him who carried her through the cold." For a long time, Caleb stared into the soil at his feet. "I ain't much for travel." Eli nodded. "That's what I told her. She said she knew. Said she wasn't going anywhere either." The barn became more than a meeting place. That summer, it hosted its first wedding, and the following fall, the first harvest festival. Caleb didn't dance, but he stayed near the fire, watching the town laugh and sway under the string lights that hung from beams he'd raised with his own hands. And when Maggie brought him a piece of pie and sat beside him, her head leaning against his shoulder, it was clear. No one remembered the man who hadn't been invited. They only knew the man who came anyway, and never left. The West had a way of forgetting men like Caleb. But Dry Hollow didn't, because when the cold came and the night was long, he was the only one who walked into the dark. And by doing so, he didn't just carry a girl. He carried a town out of its own silence, and into something far warmer, something like belonging, something like home. Years passed, as they always do out west, not loudly, but like wind smoothing stone. The town grew in small, steady ways. New faces arrived, old ones passed on, but some things never changed. Caleb remained rooted. He didn't chase opportunity or try to outrun time. Instead, he walked the same trails, worked the same soil, and kept the same quiet routine that had once saved a life. And as Dry Hollow evolved, it kept his story alive, not through plaques or monuments, but through memory passed from one firelight to the next. Children who had once watched him from behind fences now brought their own sons and daughters to the barn. They told the story of the girl in the snow, of the man who carried her through frost, and of how a town opened its doors not out of pity, but because it finally recognized courage in its purest form. Caleb never corrected their retellings. He never added details or claimed more credit than what was given. He'd just nod slowly, offer a quiet smile, and return to his work. One winter evening, when the frost returned as it had so many years before, Maggie walked with him through the same trail where he had first found her. Now a grown woman with her own stories, she carried a lantern, though the path was familiar. "You ever think about that night?" she asked softly. Caleb, staring ahead, replied, "Every day." She looked at him, brow furrowed. "Not because of what happened to me," he said after a moment, "but because that was the first time I ever felt seen." That confession stayed with her. It revealed something no one else had understood. Caleb hadn't rescued her to be a hero. He didn't seek redemption or validation. He did what he did because it was right, and because somewhere inside him, he hoped someone would finally look past the silence, past the dirt, past the shadow. That night had saved them both, in different ways. One girl escaped the cold. One man escaped invisibility. And when they returned to the edge of town, the lanterns flickering once again for the winter festival, it was Maggie who turned to him and said, "You should light the first one this year." Caleb paused, as if unsure whether it was truly meant for him. But when he saw the townsfolk waiting, no longer hesitant, but hopeful, he reached for the flame and held it steady. In that moment, surrounded by warmth and faces that once turned away, Caleb became more than the man who carried a girl through the cold. He became the one who taught them all how to feel again. There came a day when Caleb's place on the porch sat empty, the chair rocking gently in the breeze, the cup of coffee untouched. He hadn't left without notice. His boots were still by the door, his coat still hanging on the same old nail. But the townsfolk knew, not with panic, with reverence. When a man like Caleb leaves this world, he doesn't vanish. He settles into the wood, the trail dust, the wind between fences. And Dry Hollow felt that shift like the hush before a storm. Maggie was the first to speak, what everyone felt. He walked through the cold, so we wouldn't have to. The barn filled that evening, not for mourning, but for memory. People shared stories. Some cried, some laughed. Children who never met Caleb placed candles at the foot of the garden he had built, now blooming with spring's earliest blossoms. And in every voice, there was a common thread. Caleb had changed them, not with speeches or sermons, but with presence. Relentless, quiet, unshakable presence. They didn't bury him on a hill. Caleb had asked for something simpler. A stone near the trail where he first found Maggie, beneath a cottonwood that bent toward the sun. On the marker, no dates were carved. Just a single line. He stayed. And that was all anyone needed. Because in a world that often runs, retreats, or forgets, he had stayed. Through winter. Through silence. Through every season that demanded more than most men could give. In the years that followed, the festival always began the same way. Maggie, now the town's teacher, would gather the children at the barn. She'd tell them about the man no one invited, the girl no one expected to survive, and the long walk that changed them both. Then they'd walk, lanterns in hand, along the old trail. And at the cottonwood, they'd leave something behind, a flower, a note, a drawing. Not because they were told to, but because some stories deserved to be carried forward. And so Caleb's legacy lived on, not in grand monuments or golden plaques, but in footsteps retraced with care, in the warm cider poured slowly, in the barn light flickering in winter wind, and most of all, in the reminder that even if no one invites you, even if the world tries to forget you, the most powerful thing you can ever do is show up anyway, and carry someone else through the cold. With each passing season, Caleb's trail became more than a path. It became a rite of passage. Young couples walked it before their weddings. Elders visited it in silence when they needed peace. And every child in Dry Hollow grew up knowing how to find a cottonwood tree, where a simple stone reminded them of the man who never asked for anything, but gave everything he had. They learned that heroism doesn't always wear a badge or ride a stallion. Sometimes it walks alone through the cold, carrying a child in its arms. The barn, too, never stopped breathing. It hosted music, community dinners, lessons on woodcraft, and the town's quiet reflections after hard years. But above all, it remained Caleb's, not in name, but in spirit. There was a small lantern permanently hung at the doorway, and every year on the anniversary of the walk, someone, often Maggie, lit it at dusk. It was a signal, not to the world, but to the town itself. Remember who you became because of him. Maggie kept a journal by the hearth, and in it, she wrote a single entry every year. Never long, sometimes just a phrase. He saw me when I was fading. He showed me what strength really looks like. He didn't save me to be a hero. He saved me because that's who he was. Over time, others added their thoughts. The stable boy wrote, he taught me how to hammer straight. The mayor's widow penned, he made our town honest. These weren't tributes, they were echoes of impact. Even visitors from out of town would stop to ask about the barn, the trail, the story. Locals would sit them down, pass them a hot drink, and begin the tale as if it had happened yesterday. There was once a man no one invited. They'd begin. And somehow, no matter how many times it was told, it always left the same stillness in the room. That rare kind of silence where everyone feels a little braver, a little softer, a little more willing to carry someone else's weight for a while. Because Caleb's story wasn't about drama or victory. It was about presence, about showing up when no one expects you to, about offering warmth in the bitter wind. And in a world that often chooses pride over compassion, that simple act, walking through the cold for another, had become a legend. Not because it was loud, but because it never faded. Eventually, Dry Hollow changed the way it celebrated. The festival still had music, still had pies, still hung lanterns from porch posts, But now it began not with dancing, but with a moment of silence at the cottonwood tree. Each child, each parent, each elder would touch the stone marked he stayed and leave behind something small, a pine cone, a ribbon, a word scrawled on folded paper. And though they never said it aloud, everyone knew why they came. To remember what it means to stand for someone else. Maggie, now with silver in her hair, continued to keep Caleb's memory alive, not through stories of sorrow, but through lessons of hope. In her classroom, she taught the children how to find their voice, and more importantly, how to listen. You don't need to be loud to change the world, she'd say. You just need to stay when it matters most. And when students asked her who taught her that, she'd smile and point to the trail. A man who walked me through the cold. One year, on the coldest night of December, a snowstorm hit Dry Hollow unexpectedly. A young boy got lost near the hills. Panic gripped the town. But before search parties could even organize, they found him, wrapped in a shawl, safe beneath the cottonwood. A man walked with me, the boy whispered. Tall, quiet, said I'd be okay. But no one had seen anyone. No tracks, no prints, just the boy, shivering but alive, and a small tin lantern burning in the snow. Some said it was imagination. Others said it was legend. But Maggie just nodded softly and whispered to herself, he stayed. And in her heart, she believed it. Because men like Caleb don't disappear. They become part of the land, of the wind, of the quiet strength that moves through people when they choose compassion over comfort. In the Old West, that was the highest honor, to live in silence, but leave behind something eternal. So if you ever find yourself lost in the cold, unheard, unseen, remember this. You don't need to be invited to matter. You don't need permission to make a difference. You just have to show up, with heart in your hands and steadiness in your soul. Because sometimes, the act of carrying someone else through the dark becomes the light they, and the world, were waiting for. Caleb proved that. And in Dry Hollow, they'll never forget it. In a land where strength was often measured by the weight of a gun or the sharpness of a stare, Caleb reminded everyone that the quietest man could carry the heaviest truths. He was never asked to be a hero. He was never offered a seat at the table. But he showed up anyway, not with noise, but with purpose. Through frost and silence, he carried more than a dying girl. He carried the dignity of a town that had forgotten how to see the invisible until he forced them to remember. His legacy was never written in headlines or carved into gold. It lived in small choices, the way people began listening more closely, offering hands instead of turning backs, staying instead of walking away. And perhaps that's the most powerful change of all, the kind you don't see at first, but feel in the way a town begins to breathe differently. Caleb didn't change Dry Hollow with speeches or promises. He changed it by showing up when no one else did. That's the lesson he left behind, not just for the people who knew him, but for all of us watching now. You don't need permission to do what's right. You don't need to be welcome to make a difference. Sometimes, the greatest act of courage is walking forward when no one expects you to, and carrying someone through the cold, even if your own legs are shaking. Because it's in those moments, quiet, unseen, that real character is born. And if you take one thing from this story, let it be this. Your presence matters. Your choice to help, to stand, to not look away. It might be the light someone else is waiting for. The world may never cheer for you, but someone will remember. Not what you said, but how you stayed. Caleb proved that a single man, even uninvited, can change everything, simply by refusing to let another soul fall. If this story moved something in your heart, if it made you think of someone who stood for you, or made you want to be that someone, then don't let it end here. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story that needs to be told. Leave a like if Caleb's strength inspired you, and share in the comments. Who carried you through your cold? Or better yet, who are you willing to carry now?